A real privilege to welcome today on behalf of PEPAYS Ireland as well as the PEPAYS department. So, two organizations, Dr. Tim Fletcher. Tim is an assistant professor at Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario. Originally Australian, he's still Australian, originally from Australia. Did his undergraduate and his graduate diploma work in Australia, and then moved to the other side of the world. He did his PhD at the University of Toronto in Canada. He is known for a number of things, and we won't tell you all of those things, but he's looked a lot at teacher socialization, at teacher identity, at teacher education in a broad sense. But I think I can safely say he, with some of his colleagues, Alan Evans and Ash Casey, have really been the ones in physical education to put the notion of self-study on the radar. He and Alan Evans recently edited a book on self-study research in physical education. They have now put together a monograph or a special edition of a journal on self-study and physical education. So he's really been the ones to put that research paradigm kind of in the radar of physical education. And so Tim, a warm welcome to you. Thank you. He needs extra applause. He literally flew from Toronto last night. He has not been asleep yet. So keep him engaged so we can keep him waiting. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. If I start leaning to one side a little bit too much during the presentation, it may be the jet lag getting to me. But thank you very, very much for having me. It's a real privilege for me to be able to come to PEPAYS today to speak to you. I've been following the work that's been going on here from various parts of the world. Well, actually Cassandra sitting over there when I met Cassandra at Brock University, and was saying, you know, if I were in your shoes as a potential postgraduate student and I could go anywhere in the world, I'd be going to the University of Limerick. So the privilege is mine to come here. I really thank Missy and Deirdre for setting this up. So. And coordinating today. So I hope that that the presentation I've prepared for you is informative. Hopefully I've left enough time at the end for questions, lots of questions. Can feel free to come. As Missy mentioned, I am Australian. This is not a Canadian accent, but if you're wondering where I am located at the moment, you may be familiar with that image. That's Niagara Falls. We're about a 20-minute drive from Niagara Falls, and Brock University is the University of the Niagara region. So if waterfalls is not your speed and you prefer something more like this, we also have a fantastic wine region in Niagara that actually comes from the company that my wife works for. So if you like waterfalls and you like wine, Brock and Niagara region is a pretty good place to be. So that's where I am at the moment. More specifically, that's an overview there of Brock University. We're the only university, definitely in North America, I think maybe in the world, that is in a UNESCO biosphere. The trees that you see here is the Niagara Escarpment, which runs from Niagara Falls all the way up to the Bruce Peninsula, a distance of 400 kilometres or so. So we're really lucky to be there at Brock. It's a university of about the same size as Limerick, I think, about 19,000 students. We also have, I like to think, a fairly strong physical education team there. We have a research centre that is certainly not putting out the same level of work as you are here at PEPAYS, but we're very passionate about the work of physical education and instilling a love of movement in children and across the spectrum. So what we're doing today, considering the self. That is my daughter Abby, so the reason that I'm still standing is because sleep is not big on the priority list at our house. I put that photo there for a reason, because today we're a society obsessed with the selfie, and there are a lot of critics and considerations of the self come under intense scrutiny with this selfie-obsessed culture. Although considerations of the self have been ongoing for many, many years, there's a rich theoretical history around the self, back to the work of Herbert Mead, Cooley before him. This is in the early 1900s. Irving Goffman, as he said, I've done a bit of work on identity and socialization. That's very much linked to the self. However, there's not so much a similar rich methodological history surrounding the self, and those critics of methodologies that focus on the self are still fairly loud and proud in the research community. It is a fairly recent innovation. A lot of people would say that self-study as a methodology focused on the self has come about. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to sort of do a self-study 101, introduce to you self-study in itself. What is self-study? Try and think about some of the things that self-study might be able to tell us. So you're thinking to yourself, why would I care about doing this? How can I benefit from it as a teacher or teacher educator or as a professional in general? And then if you want to take your self-study work a little bit further, how might you be able to go about this? The question that I've put up there, or the second set of questions, how is self-study different or similar to other methodologies, reflective practice, action research, autoethnography, and narrative inquiry? I've put that up there because that tends to be the most common question that I'm asked about self-study. How is it different from these other qualitative methodologies, these forms of practitioner research that do have in some way or another a focus on the self? This is quite understandable because there is a lot of overlap, and in a few slides I'll get to that. But self-study, very briefly, is a form of practitioner research, and in its initial phases it was developed primarily for use by teacher educators. The use of self-study, though, is expanding beyond teacher educators to teachers. There's health professionals who have used it, some nurse educators who have used it as well. But I think in the fields that we work in, there is tremendous scope to expand its use even further. It recognises the distinct skills and knowledge that professionals have and or require, particularly teacher educators, to effectively teach teachers. So while you may see the acronym, we're using it today, SSTEP, S-S-T-E-P, that stands for Self-Study of Teacher Education Practice. That is an acronym that's commonly used in the field. However, I think a more appropriate acronym that we might be able to use is SSOP, Self-Study of Practice, so that any professional might think of using self-study to inquire into their own practice. To get to the similarities of self-study, the ways that self-study is similar to these other forms of practitioner research, Below and Pinnigar in what's a seminal paper in Educational Researcher in 2001 describes self-study as a mongrel. So it uses some traditions from action research, it uses some traditions from autoethnography, some from reflective practice and narrative inquiry, and sort of comes at the centre of all of those methodologies meeting together. So the way that they distinguish it from those other methodologies, though, is to say that the study is always a practice, but at the intersection of self and other, its methods are borrowed. In the book that Alan Ovens and I edited last year, we suggested that self-studies consider the self in practice. A common point that a lot of people find some confusion or murkiness about, and murkiness is probably an appropriate term, is between action research and autoethnography. The way that I like to distinguish the three methodologies, autoethnography, action research, and self-study, is that autoethnography has a distinct focus on the self at all times, but it's not necessarily the self in practice, it's on the self. Action research, the focus is on the practice, but not necessarily on the self performing that practice. Self-study is the bridging of those two. It is the self in practice. So I think its closest methodological cousins are action research and autoethnography, although some may disagree with me there. Richard Tinning, in one of the chapters that was in the edited book that we suggested, that we wrote there last year, put self-study under the umbrella of reflective practice. It is a form of reflective practice, but and I give credit to Alan Ovens for this reframing, which is a term itself common in reflective practice, that self-studies are perhaps more about refraction rather than reflection. Reflection suggests that you see back, you look back and see something as it is presented and it's fairly clear. Refraction, however, is seeing things from a different angle. So you have a very specific point of view, but you're interested in what those different angles present to you and how that can allow you to see things differently. So in this way, self-study is a very forward-thinking methodology rather than retrospective. So its main overlap with reflective practice, then, for people who are familiar with the work of Donald Schoen, is akin to reflection in action rather than on action. So as I'm engaged in my practice, what's going on here? What are these questions that I'm wrestling with? What are these decisions I'm making all the time as I'm teaching students? Because self-study is I like to think of it as a forward-thinking methodology, there are a series, a fairly logical series of steps, because, and I'm making this point because some people have said, well, I'll just do a self-study on some things that happened 2 years ago, or that have happened over the last 2 years. Those in the S step, so that self-study teacher education of practice community, would say that's not a self-study of teacher education practice as we've sort of bracketed it. That would be more like reflective practice or narrative inquiry or autoethnography or life history. So self-study is that forward-thinking methodology. So typical steps in a self-study, much like climbing a mountain, it's a logical series of steps. The first step is to identify the problem of practice that you might be looking at and situate that within the theoretical and empirical literature related to that problem. So as an example, that problem of practice that you may be wrestling with as a professional, let's take teachers as an example, may be assessment. I'm really struggling to identify effective ways of assessment, to understand how students respond to assessment. That's my problem of practice. The problem of practice may be my enactment of critical pedagogy, and situate that within in the literature, and develop some research questions. Again, they'll be fairly broad research questions at the start, which can be refined later on, much like most other forms of qualitative research, and move forward from there. The next logical step, once you've identified the problem, which might be the mountain, you have to identify the tools that you're going to use. So what are those data gathering methods going to be? One that most self-study researchers rely upon quite heavily is journals or diary entries, which can be open-ended or structured. As we'll get to later though, there is, and sort of counterintuitive in a way, there is a necessity for self-study researchers to engage others in their research at some point. There's a heavy reliance on critical friends, which are colleagues close to you, who understand and can relate to some of the issues that you're going through, but can also push you to see things differently, to get that refraction rather than reflection. So once you've identified your tools, then you can start to undertake understanding that problem of practice through generating and analysing data based on that problem. Working with the critical friend, interviewing students if that's the case. And the last point is something that, again, I think sets self-study apart from some other forms of practitioner research. Those in the self-study community really emphasise that self-study researchers have a responsibility to share their findings. Now, if you're a university lecturer, that sort of comes with the job description as well, that you're expected to publish research, you're expected to present at conferences in academic journals. However, for teachers working in schools or for coaches working in community settings, sharing their findings in academic and professional journals isn't necessarily a realistic option or choice, logistically, practically, whatever it may be. But that means that you share your findings with others in your community. That community, I don't want to say community, that professional learning community that you're engaged with. So colleagues who work in the same soccer club that you do, other teachers in your cluster of schools, whatever it may be. But sharing those findings, so taking the inward findings and sharing them outward, allows others to start to understand and to prick some points in some of the issues that you raise as well, and so to generate knowledge, to generate professional knowledge. This last point too is what one of the, I would say, leading figures in self-study, John Lochran, has said. This is what sets self-study apart from just another form of professional development. This responsibility to share work with others makes self-study research as part of their own community, I suppose. So this is all fairly, I mean, it should be making sense, I think, if you're understanding some of the steps in research at the moment. There are some very strong theoretical orientations and traditions in which self-study research is grounded. Probably first and foremost is the professional knowledge of practitioners, so in this case we're talking about teachers or teacher educators. A lot of what practitioners know, particularly teachers or coaches, tends to get pushed down or ignored a little bit. And self-study research, the case is being made that it is a form of research that allows practitioners to make their knowledge known, to make it public, to make it debatable, to make it a point of critique. And Lee Schulman has talked about this, and there was a special issue of the journal Teaching and Teachers in 2009 on thinking of teaching as a discipline in itself. There's a specific and particular type of knowledge that teachers need that make it distinguishable from other forms of professional practice. So that's one of the first theoretical orientations. Professional knowledge, I mean, the work of Donald Schoen, Connolly and Clandinin, going back to at least the 1980s and perhaps back to John Dewey before that. So there's a rich theoretical tradition that upon which self-study is based. The second point there, self-study as a way of being for and with others. Stephanie Pittinger and Bob Below wrote this in the self-study, the International Self-Study Handbook, which was published in 2004, and they suggested that this handbook was a real touchstone for the self-study community. It took, I think, self-study research from bubbling away at this level to now we have a solid base upon which to grow, and it has, I would argue, just gone up from there. They suggest, though, that once the history and theoretical context of self-study was articulated, that there was an ontological foundation of self-study that was defined by a moral commitment to better understand ourselves as teacher educators in relationship to the practices that mediate our human connections so that we can better care for others. It is, therefore, a reflection of a particular moral stance to the world. So, Pittinger and Below would suggest that by undertaking self-study research, self-study researchers take on a moral commitment to understand their practice better so that their students may benefit from it. We're always trying to think of the next step. Third theoretical orientation of self-study is that it takes a social constructive view of learning from different angles. Thinking about, from a teacher-educator's perspective, how do we learn about teaching teachers from sharing the work of what we know about teacher education? And what do we learn about learning to teach from working to teachers and working with teachers and interacting with our peers? And what do we learn about learning in a broad sense from the self-study enterprise. Once those questions were raised, this led to another touchstone for the self-study community in 2006. Again, this was authored by John Loughran, when he wrote about developing a pedagogy of teacher education. So thinking about how we teach teachers, thinking about how teachers learn, and learn about teaching, and then how teachers learn about learning as well. So in terms of the social constructivist perspective, we're always relying on others to generate knowledge, not just an internal propositional form of knowledge. Another theoretical orientation that I think distinguishes self-study from other forms of practitioner research, and I guess underlines its importance as well. These two terms, episteme versus phronesis, which was raised by Kessels and Kortagen in 1996 and 1999 in Educational Researcher. For those who are familiar, this is quite an impactful publication. So what do these words mean, episteme and phronesis? I don't even know if I'm saying those correctly, so we'll just go with that pronunciation, or I will just go with that pronunciation for the moment. But briefly, episteme aims primarily at helping us to know more about many situations, so it's theory in a big sense. So you might think about critical pedagogy, you might think about social constructivism, for example. These are big ideas about how the world works. And certainly they have a place in teacher education. However, Kessels and Kortagen argue that phronesis, which relies mostly on perceiving more in a particular situation and finding a helpful course of action on the basis of strengthened awareness, is a type of knowledge or a type of theory which is more relevant and applicable for teachers. So again, this is not to ignore epistemic theory, but they are arguing that phronesis, so this is little t theory, so these personal theories that we have about teaching that are causing us to make decisions one way or another as we're in the moments of teaching, are perhaps more relevant for teachers and other professionals than this big T epistemic theory. Not to stop there though, they also suggest that epistemic theory probably follows from the little t phronesis theory, phonetic, I'm assuming, forms of theory. So by understanding things that work well in the particular, in these contexts, in these situations, we can become more aware of how they apply to the bigger theories that are out there. Teachers rely a lot on interpreting situations, they rely a lot on interpreting emotions from themselves, from their students, their experiences, their values, and all of these things inform split-second decisions that are going on constantly in every teacher's day-to-day work. So again, these theoretical ideas really form a lot of the groundwork that was laid for the development of self-study. One of the other challenges, particularly in terms of this little t theory, is that if you ask a teacher to articulate and explain all of those decisions that are going on in their mind as they perform these actions, that is a very difficult thing to do. The teacher educators to be able to make their knowledge explicit and articulate. So if this group is, for example, a group of pre-service teachers who I might teach, what am I thinking as I'm standing here? Why am I standing here and not over there and not at the back of the room? Teachers don't learn to teach just by watching teachers. They need to be brought into the decision-making processes that are going on. However, for professions, for teacher educators to be able to articulate those decisions and then say, hang on a minute, that didn't work very well. What are my options? Why shouldn't I have stood over there, or let's explain this and talk this through. That doesn't happen very often in pre-service teacher education. And that's what self-study is, I guess, encouraging teacher educators to think about and to do. The other theoretical orientation that I'm going to talk about today is that many self-study researchers would probably argue that their inquiries try to address at least one of these three main problems of learning to teach that Darling Hammond suggested in 2006. The first is the problem of the apprenticeship of observation. So the apprenticeship of observation, for those who aren't familiar, is the idea that most teachers teach the way that they were taught when they were students in K-12 settings, and disrupting that memory, if you like, and that tendency to fall back on the way that you were taught. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the socialization of new recruits? How do we enact teacher education pedagogies that allow for different ways of thinking about teaching? The second is the problem of enactment. So as an example, one of the big criticisms of critical pedagogy has been, yes, it articulates a stance very well, but the explanation of how you go about that and the challenges in doing that, the enactment, how it happens on the ground level, has caused a lot of questions to be raised. And so aligning our beliefs with our practices, so putting our beliefs into action in a teaching and learning context, can be quite challenging, and articulating those challenges is another avenue that tends to be a focus of self-studies. And the third is the pure complexity of teaching. All of these different things that are going on in every moment in a classroom. Am I dealing with the tractor that's going past out there, the lights that are on, or the technology's gone, what am I teaching here? All of these things that are going on. Teaching is a very, very complex profession, thing to do, but and articulating that to people who are learning to teach can be very challenging in and of itself. Understandably, and there's quite a bit of evidence for this, that most pre-service teachers want fairly concrete answers. I want to know, what do I do on Monday morning when I go into that classroom? I want that recipe book. But just suggesting that teaching is a very, very complex endeavour and it's not so easy to just provide a prescriptive set of recipes is one of the main problems going on here. So in articulating these problems and talking about these, what self-study researchers are doing is explaining how they teach teachers. However, Geert Keltermans, who's a researcher from Belgium, has said that only goes so far. Self-study researchers really need to focus on how understanding who I am and how that influences how I teach, that is the defining factor that makes self-study distinguishable from other forms of research. So his paper, Who I Am in How I Teach Teachers, this was based on a chapter written by Tom Russell, who was one of the founding members of the self-study research community. I wrote a paper in 1997, Teaching Teachers, How I Teach is the Message, for those who might be familiar with Marshall McLuhan's statement, the media is the message. Tom Russell's spin on that, how I teach is the message. However, Keltermans pushed that further in 2009 and said we really need to think about who I am in how I teach is the message. That's where the self comes into self-study. That's where the identity comes in. That's where your experiences, your beliefs, your values, and the ways that you enact those in a learning situation, that is where self-study is at its most powerful. So when we think about who I am in how I teach, that again goes back to the self in practice, those two areas meeting together. So that's a very brief description of what self-study is. Very brief. There's a lot of literature out there which goes a lot further than I have. Perhaps some more important questions are, what can self-study tell us? And any researcher will tell you that question about so what is always what you should be asking yourself throughout a form of research. The reason that I've put this picture up there, that is not one of my children, by the way, I do have a similar photo of one, both of my children doing that actually, is because self-study has been criticised, and quite rightly so in some instances, for just being a form of navel-gazing. Totally inward looking. Why should I care, or why should you care about what I do in the classroom? Why should you care about what I believe and how that affects how I go about teaching teachers? One of the things that I think was an impetus for the self-study research community going from just a group of people meeting to a very powerful form of research was an acknowledgement that self-study strongly considers the beliefs, values, knowledge and experiences of the practitioners who are engaged in the practice being researched. This is because prior to the mid-1990s, and I'm not in the best position to talk about what went on there perhaps, but some of the critiques were that a lot of the research on teacher education was being conducted by people who weren't involved intimately in a teacher education enterprise itself. They weren't in the classrooms teaching teachers. And what self-study was able to do was to give voice to those people who were on the ground, if you like. But again, the critics were saying, well, why should I care what someone is doing in a class of 20 students? How does this go beyond what's going on over there? How does that apply to my classroom in Australia or New Zealand and the students that I have? One of the major points about self-study too is that in sharing the findings, so in going back to that last point in the steps of self-study, it's making an explicit, an overarching goal or an explicit goal of its work is to contribute to the knowledge base of teacher education more broadly. And so it, in doing that, in sharing the research, that is the point of, or that is where you get it to go beyond navel gazing. If it's just kept to yourself, if you're an individual self-study researcher doing that research and you just keep those things to yourself, that's when it does become navel gazing. But in sharing the findings and in putting it out there for debate, asking people the degree to which it resonates with their experiences, that's when it goes beyond the self, turning inward outward, if you like, and helping to answer these so what questions. Why should I care about what's going on? One of the things that, again, another main criticism in terms of the navel gazing that's been going on, and this was a really important paper by Ken Zeichner in 2007. There was a large criticism that a lot of the work in self-study was too inward looking. It was just focused on the person engaged in the practice, and it wasn't relating to the things that had gone on before in the research community, so they weren't making those connections to or building upon the work that has gone before, the understandings that have been generated about teacher education before. And that came from both theoretical and empirical perspective. So if you look at some self-study papers in the early 2000s, it's almost a narrative from this is where I teach, this is the problem that I'm facing, here's how I dealt with it, here's where we are now, with maybe 3 or 4 references. And most undergraduate students would be able to tell you, well, how is that scholarly? You know, there's a whole body of work here that's getting ignored. And so that Zeichner paper in 2007, and these have been conversations that have been going on in the self-study community as well, conferences and so on, and probably I would say this is going to be the next touchstone paper for the people in the self-study community by Vinash and Keltermans. It's called The State of the Art in Self-Study, just published this year. They are really urging self-study researchers to establish these chains of inquiry, and I think that some of the work that's going on in self-study here at PEPAYS is meeting that head-on by more collaborative forms of self-study. But also, people have not been doing a good job of stringing their own self-studies together. If you just do a one-and-done self-study, it's not really going back to that way of being, that ontological commitment. So if I'm labeling myself as a self-study researcher, I've got oodles of problems of practice that I'm dealing with every day, and it's tackling those in a systematic way and being able to string them together to be able to say, right, after I've linked these together, established this chain, so what now? What do I feel I can legitimately say about my understandings of my practice, and how do you respond to that understanding? Those things are only fairly recent advances in the self-study literature, and I can only think of quite a couple off the top of my head. The third point there, how is this part of a broader program of teacher education research? How does self-study work contribute to bigger questions about teacher education? That is something else that's being urged in the self-study community. This has ruffled some feathers from some self-study researchers, and I think Vinash and Keltermans did quite a good job of explaining how some of these tensions can be realised, because if you focus too much on building upon previous work, you're meeting the rigorous standards of scholarship by grounding it in theoretical and empirical literature. You're connecting it to a broader program of research. They have suggested that that's probably you're moving to questions that the research community is demanding about rigor, which absolutely needs to be addressed. But also thinking about effectiveness. Well, how effective is this approach? They're leaning towards some prescriptive understandings of teacher education research, which most people who are engaged in it would probably say doesn't work because the context in which teacher education goes on have too much of an impact. And so Vinash and Kelterman said self-study researchers are constantly managing tensions between these two concepts on the top there, relevance and rigor. How is it relevant to my personal work, but how am I also meeting these rigorous standards of scholarship at the same time? How do I manage that tension and not go too far one way, where my voice gets lost in the rigor, or going too far to relevance when it's just my voice? The other tension then is effectiveness and understanding, which is how can other people learn from the insights that I've gained. Too far towards understanding again is too contextual. So it's managing that tension, falling somewhere in between these red lines, and I think that's going to be something that a lot of self-study researchers in the next few years are going to really have to consider and wrestle with as they go through their inquiries. In 2004, Vicky Lebowski gave a set of guidelines, you might say, or characteristics on ways that self-study researchers can try to manage these tensions, and she suggested the following guidelines for criteria. So if you're engaged in self-study research, and this is moving on to my next question at the same time, if people are submitting self-study research papers to academic conferences, to journals and those sorts of things, a lot of reviewers will ask how these guidelines for criteria are addressed, and they want them to be fairly explicit. In saying that, there is also a bit of debate that shouldn't be the only set of characteristics. However, that's a debate that's ongoing. The first one, is this inquiry self-oriented and or self-initiated? So is the problem of practice relevant to the work that I'm doing? Was I engaged in a teaching and learning situation and saying, I really need to figure out how to do this better, or I'm really struggling to understand what's going on here. This needs work. The second is that it's improvement aimed. You undergo the investigation in order to get better, to be better, and maybe it's to be better at living up to that moral commitment to engage in this work. The third one, and this is probably one of the most important and misconstrued, is that self-studies are always interactive at some point in the inquiry. Now, what does that mean, interactive? And again, that's counterintuitive to a self-study, but it means that there's other voices involved in the inquiry at some stage. Some of the self-studies that I've done with Deirdre, for example, I work with Deirdre as critical friends. So we'll reflect on a teaching episode that's going on. Once we've identified the problem of practice first, we'll reflect on a teaching episode. I'll send Deirdre a reflection who'll then comment on it and say, how about this? Did you consider this? Yep, I get this. I experience the same sort of thing. I respond, and that conversation keeps on going. We'll talk on Skype regularly. And I mean, that sort of thing will happen around a physical education department staff room meeting, coaches getting together and talking about these things, but that interactivity should be occurring. It can also occur and should be occurring with the learners, with students in the classroom, with players on a team. What's going on? How is my practice affecting your learning? Did that work well or not? Why not? That requires a bit of trust and honesty and openness between the teacher and the learner as well. There's multiple sources of data, so you're not just relying solely on diaries, for example. You might be relying on interviews, lesson plans, recorded conversations. Other people will say the literature itself also forms another form of data. And the fifth is that validation is based on trustworthiness. So this idea about so what only becomes established once others who are working in the same sort of community as you are can read and judge that work and say, yes, that resonates with my experience. I can understand where you're coming from. And it's at that point that trustworthiness, I'm trusting that what you're saying is authentic, it's honest, it's open, it's transparent. And then that sparks the point for debate and opens up the inquiry further. And so if you're undergoing a self-study and are following these logical steps through and you want to get to the point of sharing, these are some of the things that, at least when I'm writing a self-study paper, and I know some others that I've worked with will do a similar sort of thing. Providing an explanation of the context, what's going on, where is it happening, who is involved, what's the political situation, the cultural climate, those sorts of things. Why did the study originate? What was the problem of practice that sparked this inquiry? So that's Lebowski's first two criteria, self-initiated or self-oriented, and improvement aim. Why was this something that I wanted to explore? How does it build on previous work? And again, this is that point that's probably been poorly done in the past and rightly criticised. So establishing a theoretical framework, and perhaps that theoretical framework is the problem of practice, as we've said. Perhaps it's assessment, perhaps it's critical pedagogy, perhaps it's more to do with you, perhaps it's more your identity. I was a competitive sports player all of my life. I'm trying to open up my classroom to new areas of physical education content, but I'm struggling coming from my sporting background to other forms of content. How does my identity as a sports player, as an active person, how does that influence my practice? The meeting of the self in practice. Okay? So, thinking about those, and again, that hasn't been done well in the past. The next point, how did you do it? Providing a clear audit trail of the data that has been generated, how it was generated, how much data was generated as well. Was it just 3 reflections? And if it was, then perhaps someone would say, well, that idea about rigour might be questioned there. But most self-studies that you read, they occur over a year. There's tens of thousands of words in reflections that have gone through. There's hours of conversations that are being used to inform the understandings that the self-study researchers are claiming that they can make. How was interactivity provided? Who were you interacting with? And how was their point of view included in the inquiry? Was it students? At what point were they involved? Was it a critical friend? Was it the literature? I've read some self-studies who have claimed that the interactivity was with the paintings of, Mary Lynn Hamilton did one where she said that the interactivity was with the painting of Winslow Homer. That's a bit too postmodern for me, but she made a case for it and apparently it worked. But so there's some options there, I suppose, that it makes sense to the person conducting the study. The multiple sources of data and what they use. Why are those things so important? If you're taking research methods courses in qualitative research, you've probably heard of crystallization, seeing things from a different angle. If you pick up a crystal and look at it, each time you get a different layer, a different perspective. It looks new each time you look around it. So how did those multiple sources allow you to see that problem differently? As teacher educators, were you and your critical friend in agreement about something, thinking, yep, we're on the right track here? And then you talk to the students and they said, that was the most boring 20 minutes I've ever spent in my life. So how do those multiple sources inform each other? The picture down there, a Rorschach design. How I interpret that, I sort of see a cross-section of the brain when I look at that picture, but you may see something completely different. So how are those alternative interpretations of the data provided for? And then the last thing that you need to, well, last set of things that you need to consider in reporting self-studies, ensuring that the findings are convincing, insightful, resonant for others in the discourse community. This is the point about trustworthiness. How much do they convince the readers that this is an authentic representation of what was going on? And it's at that point that they can say these understandings that have been explained make sense to me, and I might be able to apply it in the context that I'm working. You might think of aha or light bulb moments as well, explaining those. What was the root of that light bulb moment? What made you go, actually, that worked? I can't believe I've never done that before. I'll give you a quick example. There was a light bulb moment in a self-study that we were doing. We were focusing on, or thinking about how to emphasize social interaction. I was teaching a class on target games. And we were playing beanbag bocce. This is a group of pre-service teachers. And I said, okay, what are the people doing who are waiting your turn? What would your responses be? What are people doing while they're waiting their turn in the classroom if you're doing beanbag bocce? What could they do?
Making fun of other people.
Okay. What should they be doing? Supporting, keeping score. The common responses that the pre-service teachers I was working with, cheering. They could be doing shuttle runs, push-ups, sit-ups, being active rather than just sort of standing around. Okay. These were fairly stock standard responses. And I was going through this and I said, well, what are 70 and 80-year-old bocce players doing while they're waiting their turn? These are lifelong participants. What are they doing while they're waiting their turn? They're talking about, did you go to my granddaughter's wedding last week? Did you see that they've put a new speed hump in the main street? They're talking about things that are going on in their lives. Now, I don't want my pre-service teachers just to be talking about the speed humps in their street. But if it's about social interaction, I said, well, while we're waiting our turn, why don't we make it a point to say, I want you to learn 2 things about the people in your group that you didn't know before you came if what gets you going back to play bocce until you're 70 or 80 is that social interaction, why not make that an explicit part of learning? And that was something that just came to me in the moment, and it wasn't until I stood back and I sort of said to myself, do I believe in that? Does that make sense to me? What are the alternative interpretations? If this is physical education, shouldn't we be being physical and encouraging movement? But it was in coming to that moment that I really started to think about social interaction in a physical education classroom differently. Not necessarily saying this is the most effective way, but it's one of these moments that when I explained it to Deirdre and we had a back and forth about it, that I think I came to a new understanding of physical education practice. The other thing is then to make sure that that is reflected back on the self. How does this reflect my beliefs, what I believe is important in education, particularly in physical education? How is my identity part of the practice that I'm involved in? And then, of course, at the end, going to, so what? How are others going to learn and benefit from what I have just shared? In a paper, in a conversation, whatever it may be. I'll just make this point again, and actually that's the gym there at Brock University, and this is something that I think, again, can be done far better in most self-studies that are recorded. It's worth considering far more how much our students, and when I say our students, I'm talking about pre-service teachers mainly, how much our students' voices interact with our own, or intersect with our own. So in articulating my understandings, how much are my understandings evidenced or informed by what my students are telling me about their learning and about my teaching? And quite often self-studies have been teacher educators talking to other teacher educators, but including the student's voice more, at least considering it more, is something that we might need to go and think about more. In turn, thinking about how our students, so young people in classrooms, how the teacher educator's practice influences a teacher's practice, influences their students' learning in schools or in community settings. That is something that is entirely absent, I would suggest, in the literature, and something to think about. I'm only going to talk about getting a self-study published if anyone is thinking about doing that. As I've said before, self-study researchers have a responsibility to share their work. It doesn't become research until it's shared. Now that doesn't necessarily mean publishing in a journal, but for those of you who are interested in academic work, that's part of the job, so there is a responsibility to do that. One of the first and most obvious questions is, has self-study been published in this journal before? I know when Ash Casey and I submitted our self-study in 2012 to the Journal of Teaching and Physical Education, which has, or had a reputation as being fairly positivistic, quantitative emphasis. Not that it wouldn't publish qualitative work. We said, let's try this. But in doing that, we knew that we were going to have to give a very long and strong justification of self-study, just as I tried to do in the first 20 minutes or so of the presentation. So if the self-study hasn't been published in that journal before, you could probably expect to be asked to do that. However, most of the journals that I've got images of there, in physical education field, they've published self-studies before. It's not that self-study is widely accepted, but it is far more accepted. And I think it's at the point now where, rather than saying, we use self-study, self-study has a long and rich history, for example, X, Y, Z, you can just say, we use self-study, and this is how we did it. Rather than justifying it that, please believe us, please have faith in what we're doing. Using Lebowski's guidelines, again, particularly in journals in teacher education or professional practice more broadly, using Lebowski's principles is always good guideline, but in saying that, I would encourage people also to be open to other guidelines, but that also requires reviewers to be open to other guidelines for criteria as well. That's all that I prepared today. I hope that has given you, for those of you who are unfamiliar with self-study, an introduction into what it is and how it might be beneficial. I can say, and I'm trying to ascertain some trustworthiness here, I can honestly say that as a result of doing self-study, my practice as a teacher-educator has improved, I can't even, immensely. I have evidence for that from students, but also I'm more conscious of what I'm doing, and I'm more conscious of explaining my decisions to my students. And if you're working in schools, I think being able to explain some decisions to students, you don't need to say to 7-year-olds in a classroom, well, the reason I'm putting him in this line over here and not in that line over there, in this, you don't need to explain all those things. But thinking about why you're doing what you're doing and having strong justification for those things, that can only be beneficial for your practice. You're going to be asked to justify your practice to peers, to principals, to parents, but really thinking through these and coming to articulate our understandings of professional practice, and explaining your knowledge and becoming confident in your knowledge and inquiring into your professional knowledge is going to make you a better practitioner, and is going to increase everyone's understanding once those conversations happen. So again, thank you very much for having me today. It's really nice.
Thank you, Tim.